everybody. I'd like to thank each and every one of you for participating in the conference. And I'd like to give thanks in general for being able to be here and share with you today. And I'd like to extend a special thanks to the Garifuna Heritage Foundation as well as the entire nation of St. Vincent and the Grenadines and the Garifuna Nation as well. I was born and raised in St. Vincent, and being here on this blessed soil I think is an integral part of who I am. So although I'm via Canada now, I do put my focuses on my homeland, and so I'd like to present this paper to you, dealing with some workshops that I had the great pleasure and honor of being involved in 2009. Simultaneously, it seems, St. Vincent is the center of the Garifuna diaspora, but also reads as periphery. St. Vincent has largely been interpreted as the homeland place, but until recently, perhaps not a Garifuna space. In the past 10 years, in many spheres, in the academic world as well as on the ground here in St. Vincent, the island is being actively imagined as a Garifuna space once more. This paper seeks to chronicle and explore what I term a reimagination of Garifuna identity in rural St. Vincent by analyzing and theorizing several arts-based workshops on identity which were held here in St. Vincent in 2009, and the tensions that were revealed within them. I ultimately argue that the process of becoming Garifuna here in St. Vincent is not a transparent process of uncovering and incorporating an essential and changing and homogeneous Garifuna cultural identity. Rather, in this paper, I put forth the idea that reimagining and recuperating the Garifuna community in St. Vincent is an active process, revealing the hidden trajectories of power within the politics of identity. As revealed in the Garifuna Heritage Foundation's workshops, the Garifuna movement in St. Vincent allows us to map the ways in which the process of developing narratives of identity in the context of a social movement, and I do term what's going on here in St. Vincent as a social movement, is tied to a process of actively creating and recreating narratives of decolonization. This process is highly productive, exciting, and energizing, as all of us involved will attest to, but must be considered in the context of older colonial, Creole, and African nationalist narratives. Major questions raised by the research around these workshops are thus, what does it mean to be Garifuna in St. Vincent today? What do Vincentian artists and cultural workers, rural community members envision Garifuna culture to entail and to symbolize? And how does this engage and intersect with, contest and or collude with nationalist narratives in the colonial and post-colonial Caribbean, including the current and official narrative of the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines? So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the workshops. I'm not going to go too much into them, but I'll give a broad outline of what happened. So TGHF, it's the Garifuna Heritage Foundation, of course, was the primary sponsor and organizer of a series of performance-based gatherings, workshops, and also a roundtable plenary that took place on November 7th, 8th, and 9th of 2009, respectively. This was to roughly coordinate with the 30th anniversary of Vincentian independence from the British. So what was first scheduled to be a groundbreaking meeting of 7 historical Garifuna communities, so communities such as Oya, Fancy, Greggs, and Rose Hall, where people from these 7 locales, so we had 7 traditional Garifuna communities involved, would be organizing and meeting together in one place, and this was held in Rose Hall, our first gathering, for the first time since perhaps since the exile of the Garifuna by the British in 1797. This began to morph into a week-long series of events. It was really exciting. There was a lot of creative energy that were heavily art-based and which actively centered on promoting and provoking social change. So the TGHF 2009 Gathering and Workshop and Plenary Series grew out of a collaborative effort between TGHF and its community committees in rural St. Vincent, as well as Diane Roberts and Danielle Smith. These are 2 artists, developers, and practitioners of the Personal Legacy Workshop Series, which I'll give a little brief breakdown of, and Brendan Lakai of Arts in Action, and this is a program out of the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad. So essentially we were looking into what it means to be Garifuna in St. Vincent today. And as we've discussed a little bit, and as has come out in some of the presentations, there's unfortunately still a large, in mainstream society, and there's still a taboo associated with expressing indigeneity and talking about these things. And we felt that a performance-based investigation would be a very sort of strategic way to uncover some of these sort of identity processes, as well as to sort of decolonize the methodology, if you will, right? So we weren't just sort of going in there with this sort of Western sort of interview tactic or these very sort of strict lines. We wanted to go in there with a process that was organic and that was community-led and that was equality-based and was anti-oppressive. So we had basically Brendan's workshop, right? So he's coming from Arts in Action, was based on Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed. Okay, so just a little rundown on Theater of the Oppressed. It's the idea that there's not actors and spectators, but there's spect-actors, and that theater has intensely popular origins, and perhaps in modern and our times today, it has become a sort of bourgeois sort of artistic expression, and it's seen as sort of something that is not sort of the people. People are up on stage, the audience is removed from the process. But the spect actors basically bridge that gap. So you have people who are perhaps watching a performance who can then integrate themselves into the performance and change the way the performance is going, to express different points of view, to offer solutions to a problem that's maybe being enacted in the theatrical piece. So that was one sort of methodology that we did. And it basically, around the question of what it meant to be Garifuna and how people perceived Garifuna identity and how people sort of engaged this in addressing various social issues and problems within the communities. The second methodology, and that's going back to Diane Roberts and Danielle Smith, this is the Personal Legacy series. And this is heavily based on Central and West African theater tradition, where it's an excavation of embodied memory. So the idea that through a series of research tactics and through a series of embodied exercises that we can tap into cultural memories that are literally encoded in our flesh, blood, and bones. So as you can see, we sort of walk the line between looking very much at performative and sort of enacting things from the outside and also digging into the body. And again, these are not my methodologies per se, but these are people that I work with and who agreed very generously to come down and work with TGHF. So I was just more of a little bit of a facilitator and sort of bringing people together as opposed to sort of necessarily running these workshops, right? So we also thought we created a pretty safe space in these workshops to explore Garifuna identity in St. Vincent in the North Leeward and the North Windward. So many Vincentians in general have been grappling with questions of what Garifuna culture is, what it means to St. Vincent and to Vincentians, and the process by which the culture was lost on the island. In our Monday plenary, so we also had a sort of like a conference, a mini version of this that happened on the Monday afterwards. A lot of participants pointed to several local scholars and cultural workers who are in our audience, who had made it their life's work to research Garifuna history in St. Vincent and to learn about Garifuna cultural practices in the diaspora. Folks spoke to TGHF's mission to support these nascent social currents and interests. TGHF was identified as playing an integral role in taking these movements onto the next stage, the stage of reinvigorating, recapturing, and quote-unquote exposing the Garifuna culture in St. Vincent. It was noted, however, that the social climate was not always a nurturing one. Despite the national integration of Garifuna history and pride in the 30th anniversary of independence celebrations, much of the quote-unquote mainstream Vincentian public still are somewhat uncomfortable in identifying with Garifuna culture. Less and less so, but we can definitely see that we still have some of the trappings of colonialism and what some may say is neocolonialism. I view that as just a continuation of colonialism. And we're still struggling with that to decolonize ourselves here, right? We had a keynote address by Lilani Stewart, and she's a Lakono Arawak scholar out of Toronto. And she further set the tone of the Monday session by asking us to reimagine Caribbean history from an Indigenous perspective. So soon after, a noted cultural worker in the crowd She voiced her opinion that self-reliance, self-determination, and a connection to the land were historically the key components of Indigenous identity here in URMA, as well as a unified sense of nationhood and a sense of interconnectedness, which she painted as being in stark contrast to the ethos of individualism and consumerism that pervades St. Vincent today. I think with the spread of global capital, we can see that we're getting gradually more and more incorporated into this and into that capitalist ethos. The complex relationship that we have with global capital, which Vincentians and the Garifuna revival movement are forced to collude with, yet may simultaneously want to resist, was raised. Is there a way for Vincentian youth to recapture Garifuna culture in a way that would avoid the appropriation of the movement by the global economy? Can the Garifuna cultural movement in St. Vincent be used to decolonize our minds and bodies so that we can vision alternatives to development, or how our collective future will play out in terms of relation to the global economy? Can reclaiming Garifuna culture in St. Vincent be a starting point in reclaiming self-reliance and a connection to the land that goes beyond market-driven crop production? So that's just sort of a basic sort of intro into the workshops and a bit of description. Now I'm going to go into the analysis. So I sat down, we had a lot of footage, TGHF documented all of this, of course. This is all going to be things that are going to be in URMA House and in our archives, so I encourage everybody to use URMA House and to engage with it, and you can watch all the footage of this, okay? So it will be available. And I told Darky that I'd be quoting him in here. President of TGHF, Mr. David Williams, made a telling statement as he welcomed us and described what would take place on the Sunday afternoon workshop in Kingstown. So I know I'm kind of going from the Saturday in Rose Hall to the Monday and then back to the Sunday, but bear with me. He envisioned the process would be a place for artists, educators, and activists to garner skills and techniques to assist in the re-education of the general public about the history of Garifuna peoples here. And I quote Mr. Williams, "We have been educated about the Garifuna the wrong way, and TGHF aims to turn that around and propel it forward." Various participants echoed this idea that as Vincentians, we have been miseducated about Indigenous culture and Garifuna culture, and I can certainly attest to that growing up in St. Vincent as part of the education system here. I was taught incredibly racist and oppressive things about Indigenous peoples, and this is part of the curriculum, and this is very mainstream and very sanctioned. We have been told that this culture no longer exists on our island, that identifying as Indigenous holds a social stigma, and that our history and past is inconsequential or unimportant. This proved to be one of the most dominant themes that emerged in the workshops and the research. The idea that claiming a Garifuna identity carried with it an impetus to revise and revision historical events that have affected St. Vincent, and to imagine ourselves and our possibilities within this newly identified trajectory. It is here that Lauren Kruger's concept of retraditionalization becomes a useful tool at looking at this social movement that we're currently in the midst of in St. Vincent, and even this conference is, I believe, part of this movement. Retraditionalization implies not so much a return to pre-modern rural life, as much as a reappropriation of custom as the means to a tangible, if limited, autonomy in the present. Or perhaps not a limited autonomy, a sense of autonomy. Kruger also theorizes the process of retraditionalization as being not so much a rejection of modernity, as an attempt to appropriate certain aspects of modernity, the refashioning of the remnants of pre-colonial society into a unifying national heritage. In our case here in St. Vincent, in addition to what I've been discussing in terms of the TGHF gathering and plenary and the workshops that were a part of it, we have witnessed the declaration of Joseph Chatoyer, paramount chief of the Garifuna, as our first national hero, and an ongoing nationalist memorialization of Garifuna resistance to foreign occupation being invoked, for example, in the discourse surrounding continued decolonization and in the recent constitutional referendum. We thus witnessed the community initiatives of the past decade, which TGHF has played a huge role in, being picked up and incorporated into the national project That is, grassroots Garifuna identity that was the focus of these arts-based workshops that I'm speaking about is being mobilized for specific national and political goals in an effort to redefine the nation in the post-colonial era. The TGHF events of fall 2009 actively engaged in rememorializing post-1797 Garifuna society in St. Vincent and the attempts to revision the meaning attached to being a member of the North Windward and North Leeward communities. This may be read as action on the part of TGHF and its North Windward and North Leeward community members to manifest the tangible autonomy that Kruger speaks of. A project that involves resisting the marginalization and stigmatization of these communities in conjunction with the reclamation of an identity and the reimagination of space based on the historical presence of Indigenous and Afro-Indigenous communities. In recent years in St. Vincent, the ways in which post-1797 Garifuna present in St. Vincent has been remembered have changed dramatically. There are specific social groups and communities that are actively revisioning Garifuna culture as a source of pride, independence, as a way to reaffirm the agricultural or subsistence livelihood practiced by rural community members. These themes were very, very prominent in the TGHF events and in the workshops of fall 2009. What I'm picking up here is not just my own analysis, but literally what participants in the workshops were speaking about and enacting when speaking about what it meant to be Garifuna to them and to claim this identity. So now I'm going to move into theoretical considerations. Sorry if this is going to be a bit dry, but I think it's quite interesting. So I'm going to just locate what's going on here in St. Vincent in the broader Caribbean context in terms of social movements in the Caribbean as well as theory dealing with Caribbean history and identity. So broadly speaking, this paper is hinged on the idea that identity is a mutable and highly political construct that is both institutionally enforced and enlisted, so top-down, as well as subjectively adapted and contested, grassroots movements and from quote-unquote below. In the Caribbean, numerous regional scholars have addressed the general forms and subtleties of Caribbean identity politics. And here I wish to enlist the notion that the fluidity of identity is a defining characteristic not just of identity itself, but of a Caribbean identity specifically. Maximilian Fort's article in the Indigenous Cosmopolitanisms collection explores these intersections between the concepts of indigenous and cosmopolitan in the Caribbean archipelago, an exploration that illustrates how, in the Caribbean realm, lived experiences actively contest stereotypical notions of Indigenous identity. Notions of indigeneity as being static, authentic, and rooted to the land are shattered here in the Caribbean, as Fort notes that a Caribbean Indigenous identity is deeply fluid in nature. Referring to writers and poets along the lines of Benitez Rojo, Brathwaite, and Walcott, Fort reminds us that the Caribbean has long been imagined as a place defined by the sea, by the fluid movements and currents that surround, nurture, and simultaneously disconnect and connect us as island peoples, and as ultimately, in the words of Benitez Rojo, peoples of the sea. Understanding Indigenous identity as fluid and linked to movement is a theoretical lens that could frame a discussion of Garifuna identity in general, but it's also one that I believe provides insight into the re-arrival of Garifuna identity on the shores of St. Vincent that this paper discusses. In this same article, Fort demonstrates how globalization may work to reformulate the Caribbean and the Caribbean lived experience in ways that are more similar to a pre-colonial past. I found this quite interesting because as a scholar who is heavily sort of couched in Marxism and various other theories and ideologies, I tend to sort of really sort of look at global capital with a very sort of suspect eye. And it was very interesting here to see how he sort of looked at it as possibly a liberating force in a certain sense, and I'm going to go into that. So how can globalization be seen to reformulate the Caribbean and the Caribbean lived experience in ways that are more similar to a pre-colonial past? A past before the imposition of the modern nation state and the related fragmentation. Caribbean indigeneity, then, has long been a cosmopolitan phenomenon. In other words, indigeneity is not a matter of introversion and seclusion, of being remote and isolated, scorning and shunning outside influences, avoiding exchange, or not looking for new ways of being indigenous. I think we spoke a little bit about this before. I think in one of the films by Dr. Green, we could see an interview there. I think it was with Dr. Palasa that was sort of talking about the parameters of including and borrowing and giving and sort of the Garafunaization of certain aspects. Indeed, this identity is historically tied to transnational exchanges, connections, and movements, and this was likely the case for centuries, if not millennia, before colonialism. Ford posits the idea that in the 21st century Caribbean, indigeneity arises from processes and practices that make use of globalized cultural influences that can take the foreign and render it indigenous while building ongoing indigenous identification through transnational roots. Ultimately, he argues that this indigenous cosmopolitanism is a translocal process with translocal content that reformulates the homogenizing effects of globalization in ways that can be specifically anti-colonial. His analysis of the process of reformulating and reimagining indigenous identity in the Caribbean context not only illustrates how indigeneity in the Caribbean today troubles traditional definitions of that term, but also highlights the mutability and constructed nature of terms like indigenous, and indeed of identity itself, and points to how identity becomes a political space from which to operate, and how this space is often related to projects of continued decolonization. Historically, and here I'm going to address the SVG movement, the Garifuna movement in St. Vincent, vis-a-vis an analysis of the Puerto Rican Taino movement and some of the debates that are surrounding it. Okay, so this is just there's actually a number of social movements that resonate with this one in St. Vincent going on in the Caribbean. So again, I think that's been another theme of the conference, is to locate ourselves, regionally and to understand ourselves within this broader context in the circum-Caribbean, indeed, right? So descriptions and discussions of the Caribbean being a strictly diasporic space and or something of an indigenous cosmopolitan space were frequently linked to projects connected to the movements of global capital as a way to create an empty or de-indigenized space ripe for sugar cultivation based on African slave labor. How does this movement in St. Vincent fit into the literature on race, identity, and indigeneity in the Caribbean? This is where I'm going to start to move into the movement in Puerto Rico. Arlene Davila speaks to Taino identity resurgence in Puerto Rico in the 21st century. Viewing being Taino as a symbol adopted by various stakeholders for various political purposes in effort to transform, again, the dominant colonial model, Davila's model highlights the way in which memory is constructed and deployed in this process of a strategic Caribbean identity formulation. Interpreting the resurgence of this Taino and indigenous identity as a facet of anti-American and anti-colonial struggles in Borinquen, Jorge Duani also draws attention to the ways that the Taino movement discourse serves to further entrench an institutionalized denial of African heritage in Puerto Rico. Worldwide, the nationalist search for indigenous roots is well documented, and equally well documented is the way in which any identity formation is done at the expense of, or at the very least, the necessary inclusion of, an other. In the Caribbean context, identity processes and formulations or reformulations typically involve the denigration of our African heritage. In the strategic memorialization and imagination of the Taino community, culture and heritage in present-day Puerto Rico, Haslip Vieira and other scholars similarly point to this trend. Nationalist intellectuals in their memorialization, construction, and imagination of Taino identity have selectively referenced the island's history to exclude any celebration of African roots. Puerto Ricans have alternatively been imagined in literature and in the national in national rhetoric, have been imagined as Spanish or as Indígena or as both, but never as African. There are, however, very specific critiques of these works that I've just mentioned here in the article entitled Taino-African Intersections, Elite Constructs and Resurgent Identities by Jose Barrero. Barrero maintains that Taino identity resurgence in Puerto Rico, and in some extent in Dominican Republic, is ultimately a challenge to the thesis of extinction. So that's the main goal there, right? It's not he's saying it's not to sort of deny the African heritage, but to really address this myth of extinction that has been so detrimental to the Caribbean, as opposed to being a strict denial of African heritage. Suggesting that historically Taino and indigenous identity has been acutely denied as well, the author stresses the importance of addressing the myth of extinction, and in a series of interviews with self-identified Taino persons and leaders from Puerto Rico, brings to the forefront the idea that Taino is ultimately a cultural expression, one that does not deny any racial plurality or particularity, but rather a reclamation of one facet of a Caribbean identity that has been the most oppressed. Barrera points out that African roots are accepted in Criollo or Creole discourse, but rarely have there been any discussions that highlight the survival of any part of indigenous identity and culture in nationalist movements. And that's why I find the social movement here on Garifuna identity so fascinating, is the hybrid nature of the movement. It doesn't seem to me to be denying any particular facet, at least within the sort of the history of the nationalist movements in the Caribbean, of being either, it has to be strictly indigenous or strictly African, and the tension between this. So I see this as being a hybrid movement, where I see it very much as sort of moving between the two. And again, sort of having the continued decolonization as the ultimate goal. Social movements such as the ongoing one in St. Vincent challenge stereotypical notions of indigeneity, as well as providing an example of the malleability and political nature of identity. The idea that Garifuna identity in the diaspora is highly tied to place, with a firm sense of cultural origins being here in Euromais, and to movement from St. Vincent to Central America to the US and back to St. Vincent, and how the movement is now revitalizing Garifuna space on St. Vincent, resonates with the earlier points that I raised concerning indigenous cosmopolitanism. Amelia Ingram has a piece on ethnicity in Trinidad, which documents the institutional social reformulations that took place during the colonial era and later during the nationalist movements, which obscured, erased, or at the very least reformulated indigeneity, and forced populations to reimagine themselves within new criteria and official groups. Reviewing what historical information we can garner on what the pre-1797 Garifuna nation in Euromais looked like, and even what it looked like during colonial occupation, also shows fissures in the myth of an authentic and recoverable indigenous or Garifuna identity. Is Vanessa here? No, maybe she has left, but Vanessa, who works with the Alliance Francaise, brought a very interesting map to our gatherings. Okay, it's a French map. I believe it was dated from 1773. And in this map, the entire northern section of the island around La Soufrière is denoted as simply Terre de Charib, so the land of the Caribs. At the TGHF Rose Hall gathering, lifelong residents of the North Leeward vicinity spoke of remnants of villages and paths, hunting trails in the interior of the northern sections of St. Vincent that would have straddled the Bar de Lille. So some of the historical texts have sort of pushed this idea that the quote-unquote red or quote-unquote yellow Caribs and the quote-unquote black Caribs were these, strictly differentiated people, and that the black Caribs were very aggressive to the red Caribs, and that the colonizers had to come in and draw a line to separate and protect the quote-unquote red Caribs or the Kalinago from the Garifuna. So I've always sort of grown up and been taught that in St. Vincent and read that, that these are two very different communities. And I think today in the conference we can see that's being really much like pulled apart. So I'm looking at this map and I'm kind of going, whoa, I don't see sort of any reference to this Bar de Lille, which that was sort of, it was quite shocking to me because I'd been sort of brainwashed in that idea, And even in The Rise and Fall of the Black Caribs by Kirby and Martin, so there's reference to historical documents that describe the leeward or western settlement of Duvalier, that's the brother of Garifuna paramount chief Chatoué. And this Bar de Lille was supposed to, separate the Kalinago or the red and yellow Caribs, as is referred to in the colonial literature, on the leeward side, and the quote-unquote black Caribs or the Garifuna on the windward side. But then right there, in the same breath in the book, is talk of Duvalier having his lands on the leeward side. So that right there raised something to me where I was going, but hold on a second. If these were two starkly differentiated people in war. I just, like, how is that possible? That demands some investigation. Furthermore, Chatoy's place of residence was Morin-Rond, which is just north of Richmond, also on the leeward side, right? So you can see all these sort of fissures in the myth that these were two starkly differentiated people, which has really been a part of, I think, this morning's discussions. This underscores the complicated nature of defining Garifuna and Kalinago territories and identity, and compels us to question the dominant idea that these are two starkly differentiated people engaged in constant political conflict, to suggest that they were perhaps engaged in trade and other mutually beneficial relationships, or that the two indigenous peoples of St. Vincent, described as two groups in colonial record, did not see themselves as being so separately defined as in the manner of the European descriptions. This in turn leads to a complete questioning and revisitation of what being Garifuna in pre-1797 St. Vincent meant, and a deep inspection of what Garifuna is thus becoming or being imagined as today. So as Gilroy, Hall, Hua, and others have illustrated, identity is much more fluid of a concept than espoused and supposedly authentic markers may lead us to believe. Although much of the literature points to Garifuna diasporic identity revolving around language and a common ancestry here on Uramain, Garifuna communities in the diaspora have also, at different times and in different situations, strategically located their Garifuna-ness in broader social movements and identity-based movements. As Anderson illustrates, Garifuna activists in Honduras variously identify themselves with indigenous peoples and movements and with Afro-Honduran identity and issues. Referring to the Native American movement, Grand reiterates Hua's and Lowe's claims, stating that, and I quote, "Insofar as postmodern theories have stripped away the epistemological scaffolding used to prop up essentialist claims to authenticity, postmodernism has had an emancipatory effect, mapping instead the hidden trajectories of power within the politics of identity." So how Garifuna communities and organizations in the diaspora navigate identity politics and for what reasons is one issue, how the pre- and post-colonial Vincentian Garifuna movements have navigated being Garifuna and the identity politics surrounding the movements are another, and how they inform each other, is yet another angle to query. However, the common thread that unites these various facets is a strategic deployment of various memorialized and imagined versions of Garifuna that I believe address community needs on various levels and which exist in politicized relation to their colonial and post-colonial context. As we witnessed in the workshops, Garifuna identity in St. Vincent is being constructed as being deeply tied to social issues and national and community goals, from autonomy and self-direction to curbing drug use and cultivation and related violence, to economic integration or full-out rejection of the capitalist system, to survival, success, and opportunity. Thus, Garifuna identity today in St. Vincent is based in the popular, historical, and diasporic representation of the Garifuna, as well as understanding how Garifuna-ness can be invoked in North Windward and North Leeward's fight for national inclusion and or as a form of opposition to, as well as collusion with, global capital and related enterprise. Thank you very much.